Okay, very good. So let me take questions for Father Fabrizius. Anyone like to ask a question?
I think it was providential, Dr. Fabrizius, that Barb and I read Ezekiel during the month of September as part of our devotions. And but I thought it was rather rude of you not having the lecture a month ago before we began. But you're a friend.
There's forgiveness even for this.
Even for this. Reading through Ezekiel, I thought, oh my goodness, if my dear brothers ever get discouraged with any negativism coming from either their fellow brothers or from their parishioners, they should read Ezekiel. Poor Ezekiel just wasn't listened to. And then when they did listen to him, they just did the opposite. And it was just time after time after time. I wish Barb had been here to hear, because I think it was a very, very helpful presentation. And I thank you for that. And if any of you have not read Ezekiel for a while, read it now, having had this background, and it will be very helpful.
So for the folks seated in the back, Cantor Reuning said that Ezekiel was a source of great comfort. He and his wife have read that recently within last month. He chastised Father Fabrizius for coming a month late to give his paper. And then he said that the pastor should find great comfort in Ezekiel, because in Ezekiel, he keeps telling the people what God said and they won't do it. So I yield to Father Fabrizius.
I can't say anything else to that, really. I mean, it is striking how many times he's told the people are stubborn, disobedient, harlots, and they're not going to listen to him, but preach anyway. And there is a lot of gospel, by the way. I know I was tying in a bunch of things, and the call to repentance is strong there, but he gives them a lot of hope, those who actually will hear. It's interesting when he has to speak against the princes and the elders at one point. He discovers there's this section where he looks through a hole in the wall into the temple, and there's all these abominable practices. They're worshiping all these things. He doesn't, it's like somehow he hasn't been really aware of it, but God reveals to him, this is just how bad it is. All this is going on. And I think you're reminded of what happens from generation to generation in the church historically. Knowing the history of the church, no matter when it happens, the things that happen in Ezekiel are being repeated. The mixing the things of the world in with the practices of the church, and the failure to see the difficulties. I mean, I say the church is unchanging, but I made that comment. Luther would say the same thing. The church doesn't really change, but it needs to be cleaned up at times. And certainly it needed to be cleaned up in the days of Ezekiel, but you have that in Jeremiah, the words going on there. You see it in terms of all the prophets. And this is my own personal opinion, kind of going with Hummel. I think we neglect the prophets in many ways. And I don't know if that's a fallout from, what happened with the historical critical method and the way prophets were treated sometimes. Maybe we all got a little bit gun shy about it, or it's just so much easier to deal with other sections. The narrative is an easier part of the text. You have to know some of the things, be aware of what Ezekiel is facing all around him, the crumbling of the world, so to speak, while the Babylonians are rising to power. So there, I gave you time. I just spun some stuff. Yes, Dr. Ziley.
How does God's address of Ezekiel as the Son of Man inform our understanding of Christ calling himself the Son of Man in the Gospels?
Will you repeat that for them?
Now, the question is, how does the Son of Man issue, where the name given to Ezekiel by God when he addresses him is Son of Man, how does that really tie in terms of the Christological? Now, I made some comments about that one of them I made was, boy, I'd like to spend a lot more time on this, quite frankly, than I did for this paper. But one should always, I mean, the Son of Man, or you get sometimes the man of God in the Old Testament, that language too. These terms are always a reference to the coming one who fulfills it all. The prophets who bear that name are bearers of the word. Christ is the word made flesh. He's the ultimate man of God. I mean, we're back to John here. I know maybe Ezekiel forces me to speak more about John, but you get to that whole narrative of the trial, and it's there, behold the man. From John 1 until that, you've sort of been pointing to the man. This is the guy who's the fulfillment of Adam. But when you say that, you're also saying, behold, this is the new Elisha, Elijah, who were the man of God. It's the new prophet on the road when you have the donkey who consumes the lion who attacks the man who's the prophet on the road. Donkey didn't consume him. It is all of these references along the way. Behold, this is the man we've been waiting for. All these other men did not measure up to what has to be done. Here he is. Behold the man, the new Adam, all these fulfillments. He's the new David, because right after that in behold the man is behold your king. And though he doesn't know it, he's really saying, hey, David is here. You know, it's all there, laid out, these references. And you need to think about this when you're preaching. Somebody said to me, oh man, that was really clever of you to say, behold, the man has. No, it wasn't clever of me. Everybody should think this way. No, because the text sort of forces you. You just live in that text. I mean, to think of Josiah's death being in the time of Ezekiel and the importance of Josiah in terms of, well, what's he missed? There's your test. I love to give tests. Nobody wants to answer when but Josiah, why is he so important?
Israel's last good king.
Well, and what was the key about him? What? The reform? Yeah, they find the books, and you've got that whole, and yet Josiah too turns away from all that, doesn't he? And Josiah is young. I mean, he is one of these boy king things. And very important in terms of that, he has to be hidden so that he's not put to death. You've got all of these particular stories become important in thinking of the Son of Man. There needed to be a Son of Man who came, who was faithful to the word. From the very beginning, when you have the first Son of Man, of course, is Cain. And that Son of Man is a disaster, who, of course, does what? Who kills his brother, who is a shepherd, puts him to death. And now there needs to be one who's the real Son of Man, who is put to death as a shepherd, and who, by being put to death as a shepherd, also becomes the one who raises us up to life instead of death. The first man brought death. Oh, there's something we've heard before. But the last man, he brings life. So, yeah, all those titles matter. Yes.
You draw a parallel of Ezekiel being allowed to look inside the temple and see the desecration of it. And when Christ cleanses the table, like cleanses the temple by turning over the table of the money changers in the temple.
Okay, so can I tie together Christ cleansing the table and the looking into the temple? Yes, ultimately, of course, it has to be the work of God. The interesting thing I didn't get to talk about was Ezekiel can't go into the temple by the eastern gate, because that's where the glory of God entered the temple. Excuse me. Instead, God puts him in, picks him up and takes him and puts him inside the temple. Why do I keep saying table? And I didn't drink anything at lunch either. So puts him inside the temple, and that work of God should be clear in terms of our own being brought into the temple. Didn't come in on his own. but the one who is holy, the God of Israel, who had brought his glory in through the eastern gate, then brings him in. And then you have that whole sequence of the flowing of the water from the side of from the north side, or south side, excuse me, and which one is it? South side of the altar, and the reminiscing on Christ and his side being. So the cleansing must take place. His sort of temporary cleansing, shall we say, the fact that it may have happened twice even, I kind of lean towards it happening twice that he goes into the temple, is a reminder that, yes, the temple is still a mess. Even though, look at how beautiful it is. But, yes.
The outside view can be fool you from what's going on inside.
Right. The outside and the inside are two different things. And what was happening, what it was being used for, obviously, was in the way. Now, they, of course, would argue, well, it's far more holier this way than when, in the days of Ezekiel, all these things were going on. But I mean, we know from the Hezekiah and Josiah accounts that the temple itself was just being used as latrines. I mean, this is the temple, that they were so proud of, and yet it became a latrine. It's hard to imagine that, and yet look what happens to some modern day churches. They're kind of like big latrines. Oh, did I say that?
That title, Beelzebul, is the Lord of Flies, the Lord of the Dung Heap.
Yes.
So when they call him the Lord of the Temple is the Lord of the latrine. I like it.
I like that comparison, yes. And I'll give you credit for that.
Maybe you can go a little deeper into this subject. You mentioned it several times, the name. And actually, I heard you said the name once, but how do we know, or how does a person know what the name is that they should honor, and should keep the second commandment? 6,820 times the name is Yahweh. It's not the name, which is never used in the Old Testament. Right. Yet today, how do you make that connection between Yahweh, Yahweh's salvation, and Yahshua, Jesus, with the congregation, if they don't know what the name is, if you never hear it in the liturgy?
I think you've kind of gone there and told us the answer already. That is that when the preacher engages in talking about the second commandment and talking about the name, you have to talk about the works. All the names of God, Yahweh himself, the idea of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of Abraham, Isaac, all these parts of the name become important. Why was Yahweh itself so holy? Because it's the direct connection to the fact that he was the deliverer who brought them out of Egypt. And that makes that name holy above all the names of all the foreign gods. And so now, in the person of Christ, you have the full revelation of the name and see who that Yahweh really is, who comes in flesh and blood that we might know the Blessed Trinity and how this salvation is offered to us. That whole Aaronic benediction thing that I went into, and the need to see the Trinity in terms of that, as well as the blessing that is given by Jacob on the sons of Joseph, very Trinitarian kind of structure to that blessing also. And sometimes we don't think about that, or we've disconnected it. I think the church needs to go back to this Trinitarian thought. Is it fully revealed in the Aaronic benediction? No, but now the name above every other name has come in the flesh that we might know who that is that's being talked about. The angel who redeemed his people, for example, in that blessing that Jacob gives, that is a reference to the pre-incarnate Christ. I mean, who else can it be? Yes. I'm sorry, I cut you off.
That Aaronic benediction, it's Yahweh bless your people, not the Lord. Just, I guess, for a personal reference, I've included Jesus' name in there. The Lord Jesus bless your people. So to make some connection that this isn't just some obscure idea of the name or the Lord. There's all kinds of Lord's statements. You need to know who that is and what the connection to the Old Testament is. Why, as you said, it's so important.
Yeah, it matters. Just like the reference to the glory, and I didn't do that section in my paper either, but the glory is mentioned, and then it says his voice. So that the glory appears there, and Hummel then translates it in with a capital, referring to the pre-incarnate Christ again, because the glory has a voice. He speaks. And so this idea of using that as a pastor to see that text and to speak again in Trinitarian terms, in looking forward to the temple where God dwells in the midst of his people, and ultimately not just some spiritualistic, God dwells in my heart. Well, yeah, but notice how that old hymn we sang this morning, you sang about the fact that God dwells in the midst of the church, corporate too. I think what has happened in America, well, I don't just think, I know, and that is that there's all this spiritualization of everything. So it's all about, he's in my heart. I don't need the church. I don't need the place where his name is spoken over me. I don't need the place where his sacrament is offered to me, because it's all about my relationship with Jesus. Yeah. And corporately, it has to be there too. The Old Testament, again, and I didn't go into this in any depth, but it's not just an individual personal relationship with God, is it? Absolutely. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are having this quote unquote personal relationship with, they never say that because that's very much a modern kind of term, but at the same time, there's the corporate that goes on as well. And we can't neglect that, because it's there that you have the sacramental connections as well, whether it was the sacrificial system of the tabernacle and the temple, or whether it was already, back with Noah and the rainbow, or whether we talk about the sacramental presence of God. He attaches himself to fleshly things, even though, can God really dwell in a temple made with hands? And Solomon's answer is, only because he's declared he does. Solomon actually says, no, but you, O Lord, have declared that you will dwell in this place. Therefore, we will believe it. And no matter where we go, we can cry out to the temple, facing the temple, because we know that you've attached yourself to this place and time. So when Christ comes and he talks about a new temple and himself, and you have the tearing of the curtain in the temple and all that happens with regard to that, you see God now dwells in the flesh. And this flesh of man means, since he dwelled in the flesh, he will also dwell in your flesh, pouring out his spirit on you in the flesh. But Christ never neglects going to the synagogue. And his apostles do what? They gather together with the faithful wherever they go. And so you have to hold the corporate and the individual together at all times, because Christ came in flesh and blood, and in flesh and blood established a pattern for all of us, instituting the sacraments, and in fact, gathering people around his word for preaching. And we need to be faithful to that. Otherwise, I might as well just go off in the wilderness and drink beer and, sit by the campfire. And by the way, when I made that comment about the East, I couldn't help thinking about my childhood when all the youth groups sang what? Fall on your knees with your face to the rising sun. And I'm thinking, oh, just like, oh, yeah. Okay. Other questions? Sorry.
Your pastor says when we speak of name, it's his reputation, who he has declared himself to be. And that's what we base who we are worshiping, is who he has revealed himself to be.
Yeah, the question there, I'm not sure, but you're correct in the sense of he reveals himself. That's why the ultimate revelation is in the God who becomes flesh and lives among us. But he revealed himself at the waters of the Red Sea and in the crossing of the Jordan. And again, he revealed himself. And all these things tie into him being Yahweh, the ultimate deliverer. I mean, remember, even the judges are called deliverers, but they don't really, they have moments of deliverance. I always like the fact that they're given that name because you think of them being called deliverers, and yet kind of an embarrassing lot they were in some ways, sort of like the clergy. You know, that's me too.
Hey, I'd like to hear you talk about the four-faced creature and that big wheel.
Of course you would. Just, go back and read about UFOs and you've got it. No, historically that has been tied in again and again by the church to the movement of the gospel throughout the world, the four faces. This is why, and those four faces, by the way, already show up in Deuteronomy. Yeah, they're actually mentioned in Deuteronomy. Now, that's what we sometimes forget, that you get these four different beasts there. The fact that they're faces with wings, I like that. Notice they don't have bodies. Many times, of course, when you go into churches, they'll have the whole body of the lion and the body. No, faces with wings is intriguing because a face reveals that which is connected to it. Yeah, so the face of God is revealed in the face of his son, you could say, and his flesh and blood. So the face is connected with those, and you see early on how this helps in teaching about the Gospels themselves. The fact that you have the face of man when you speak of Matthew, the face of a man with wings, his gospel flying throughout the world, because, of course, you start with a list of all the four, those who came before, and the two key ones being Abraham and David. And them, you have the sacrifice of Isaac, and David the king, who gives birth to a son, who builds the temple. So there's all these things right away to talk about. And the opening of the gospel for the Gentiles connected with that as well, in terms of Matthew. There's all kinds of language. You can see how they made that connection very quickly between the face of a man and the Gospel of Matthew, the face of the lion. You've got the reference right away in Mark chapter 1 to Jesus being with the wild beasts. It fits well also with how there's that sort of rapid mark. You have immediately this happened, immediately this happened, immediately this, and he's healing everybody and he's doing all these things. And right from the very beginning, you have the Jew and Gentile thing going on in Mark as well. Then they made the connection with Luke to many of the sacrificial practices. And so you have the face of an ox, or sometimes bull. Ox and bull are both used. You were looking for the Deuteronomy reference. Off the top of my head, I want to say it's like 27, but I don't trust me. I'm getting old. I'm just not as sure about those things anymore. I got 3 minutes. So one, and then you've got the last beast, of course, the winged face of an eagle. And you can see how that, I mean, the heavenly things spoken of in the very first chapter, in the beginning was the Word. And so you get that connection in terms of the emphasis on the divine nature. So it's not really surprising. I think it's beneficial for the church to still be teaching this, to try to help young people especially get a grasp on why there's four different ones, giving four different pictures, and yet they're all about the same thing. So in the vision, the thing is moving like everywhere at once. Try to actually put together something that does what's in chapter 1. It's totally impossible because you can't even really describe it because your mind just can't figure out how can it be turning all this way and that way? And because the way the gospel goes out to the ends of the earth is just through the proclamation to the ends of the earth. But I love chapter 1, and it was very important in terms of making connections, again, to the call of individuals. Several people along the way in the history of the church have connected their own call, their connection being to that need to preach the gospel, and the way this mystical sort of vision came to Ezekiel. But that's